Okay, so I got the transcripts. Mitch, we have to bring slavery back. Those were the good old days. Kevin, how will we do that? There's no way we can do that. Mitch, black people won't do it, but white people will. Kevin, how will we get white people to be slaves? That sounds ridiculous. Mitch, we have to get rid of the separation of church and state. We must have state-funded religious schools. Kevin, I don't see where you're getting at. Mitch, those schools will have work programs for 4th through 8th graders. Kevin, I think I see where you're going here.
I'm not sure who needs to hear this, but saying that black people were better off under slavery and Jim Crow because they committed less crimes is not a political opinion. Saying that black women don't have equal cognitive functioning to white people, and if they are in high up positions, that must mean that they took a white person's slot, is not a political opinion. Believing that black men who die because of police violence deserved it is not a political opinion. Saying that you don't believe 1 in 5 women are actually SA'd, so then 1 in 5 women must be lying, is not a political opinion. That is white supremacy and misogyny. And white supremacy and misogyny aren't political opinions. They're political violence.
The real reason white people want to erase the history of slavery is because given the chance, they would absolutely do it again. While not all of us subscribe to this system, a lot do. That's why they like our current president, because he consistently, without fail, reinforces the hierarchy of white people on top, followed by everybody else. Of native citizens on top, followed by everybody else. I consider white supremacy to be one of the most dangerous domestic threats in the United States. Because if you didn't know, there are estimated this many active members in white supremacist organizations. People like your pastor, your neighbor, maybe someone you've seen giving looks to people of color but not necessarily saying anything. White people try to downplay the effects of white supremacy, but it's significantly more people than they will admit. And those are just the people who are overtly racist and willing to label themselves as part of this organization, not even the other people who genuinely believe in it without speaking on it. Point being, erasing the history of slavery and erasing the horrible atrocities that happened in this country is a genuine crime. And it's intentional, because if it's erased, those patterns are going to repeat themselves. So erasing this history isn't just ignorant, it's
white people ended slavery has got to be the dumbest shit crackers have ever said to me. First of all, not true, because what the fuck do you think the slaves were doing during the Civil War? Chill out at home? Well, you know, some of them did, but regardless, the point still stands. Second of all, even if this is true, so what, Timmy? You unfucked a situation that was originally fucked up by you for a very long time. That means it took a while for y'all to understand that this is fucked up. And even then, the situation is still astronomically fucked. Timmy, do you think that after slavery, everything was sunshine and rainbows? How is any of this deserving praise or acknowledgement? 10 years after the Civil War, the wealth gap between a white person and a black person is 23-1. And not to mention, lynchings. How the fuck does any of this put a smile on my face? Y'all were so mad you couldn't own people anymore. You created the Klan. Don't type in my comment section, the Klan was created by the Democrats. This is some convenient shit only the whites would say. If the originality of something determines what it is, then all crackers go back to Europe. Every white person should be forced to look at the picture of Emmett Till before he was buried. And then you will finally understand that this doesn't mean jack shit to me. And especially, it doesn't mean jack shit to my scrumptious African Americans.
When studying American history, one of the most important questions to answer is, how did Americans justify slavery? How did they convince themselves that they had the right to own black people as property? What we find is that they had numerous ways to justify slavery, including philosophy, religion, science, and straight-up lies and self-deception. One prominent way that slave owners justified slavery was by turning to the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle, who is without a doubt one of the most famous philosophers in human history. American education in the 18th and 19th centuries had a heavy focus on ancient Greece and Rome, and Aristotle's philosophy was studied by many Americans, including the Founding Fathers. Even though Aristotle was extremely intelligent and a very influential thinker, he left the world a dark legacy when it came to his views on slavery. Aristotle believed that slavery was normal and natural, and that some men were born to be masters and others were born to be slaves. He argued that humanity is divided into two, the masters and the slaves, or those who have the right to command and those who are born to obey. Therefore, to justify slavery, all American slave owners had to do was point to Aristotle. They argued that white men were the natural-born masters and black people were the natural-born slaves. However, an even greater justification for slavery than Aristotle was Christianity. Slave owners frequently justified the right to own black people as property by citing the Bible and arguing that slavery was sanctioned by God. As Samuel F.B. Morse put it, slavery per se is not a sin. It is a social construction ordained from the beginning of the world for the wisest purposes, benevolent and disciplinary, by divine wisdom. There are plenty of passages from both the Old and New Testament that condone slavery. For example, Exodus provides detailed rules about owning slaves and tells slave owners that the slave is their property. In the New Testament, Paul says, "Slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything, and do it not only when their eye is on you and to gain their favor, but with sincerity of heart and reverence for the Lord." Slave owners would often read the Bible out loud to their slaves to show them that God approved of their enslavement. For example, when Solomon Northup was enslaved in Louisiana, his master would preach pro-slavery sermons on Sundays. His favorite part of the Bible was Luke chapter 12, verse 47, which states, "The servant who knows the master's will and does not get ready, or does not do what the master wants, will be beaten with many blows." Solomon Northup described how after reading this line, his master would explain, "That inward that don't take care, that don't obey his Lord, that's his master. That there inward shall be beaten with many stripes." Now many signifies a great many. 40, 100, 150, that's scripture. One of the most popular ways that slave owners used the Bible to justify slavery was through the curse of Ham. Most of you are probably familiar with the story of Noah. In Genesis, we learn that God told Noah he was going to destroy the world in a great flood, and he instructed Noah to build an ark and fill it with 2 of every animal so he could repopulate the world after the flood was over. In the story, Noah obeyed God, and after the flood, he became a drunk. I mean, you can't really blame him. He did just watch God annihilate nearly every living being on earth. In Genesis, we hear of a strange story that involves one of Noah's drinking binges. One day, Noah gets drunk and passes out naked. His son Ham sees him and tells his 2 brothers, who cover up their father with a blanket. When Noah wakes up and realizes that his son saw him naked and dishonored him, he curses Ham's son Canaan and says, "Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be." Some Americans interpreted this passage from the Bible to mean that all of Ham's descendants were forever doomed to be slaves, and they argued that black skin was the mark of the curse of Ham. Therefore, when Americans sought to justify slavery, all they had to do was say it wasn't their fault. It was Noah who cursed them to be slaves, and since this came from the Bible, it was seen as the word of God. This story might seem ridiculous, but many slave owners used this argument to rationalize their right to own black people. It didn't matter that this story was irrational and absurd. The point is that they were able to use Christianity as an excuse to abuse and exploit black people. Slave owners also justified slavery through the scientific theories of the time, which were heavily influenced by racism and white supremacy. For example, the French scientist Georges Cuvier argued that there were 3 distinct races of human beings: the white Caucasian, the yellow Mongolian, and the black Ethiopian. He said the Caucasian is distinguished by the beauty of the oval formed by his head and the color of his hair. To this variety, the most highly civilized nations, and those which have generally held all others in subjection, are indebted for their origin. On the other hand, he argued, the Negro has always remained in the most complete state of utter barbarism. For scientists like this, the fact that white people enslaved black people was simply a law of nature. For men like this, slavery was the natural state of the black race. Others, like the French naturalist Georges Louis Buffon, believed that whites were helping black people by enslaving them. He believed that if black people were introduced to the cooler climate of the Americas, their skin would naturally turn white. He argued that in Europe, we behold the human form in its greatest perfection, and this is where we ought to form our ideas of the real and natural color of man. He said that if black people lived long enough in a cold climate, then their skin would become as white as the natives of Europe. Therefore, he believed that slavery was good for black people because it would eventually turn them white, which was the natural and perfect state of humanity. Never mind that human beings originated in Africa. Even abolitionists who opposed slavery still held racist ideas about black people. For example, the Philadelphia doctor Benjamin Rush believed that black skin was a disease that could be cured, and through the right treatment, black people could eventually become white. Another way that Americans justified slavery is arguing that by enslaving black people, they were doing them a favor. They argued that slavery was a moral good and benefited the slave. The man most responsible for this theory was George Fitzhugh from Virginia. In 1854, he published a book called Sociology for the South, where he argued that black people were inferior to whites and had to be slaves for their own good. Fitzhugh disagreed with the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal. Instead, he argued, men are not born physically, morally, or intellectually equal. It would be far nearer to the truth to say that some were born with saddles on their backs and others booted and spurred to ride them, and the riding does them good. For Fitzhugh, black people were born to be slaves. He argued, the Negro is but a grown child and must be governed as a child. The master occupies toward him the place of parent or guardian. Fitzhugh believed that a free black person was an oxymoron and said he would become an insufferable burden to society. Society has the right to prevent this and can only do so by subjecting him to domestic slavery. Fitzhugh argued that the Negro race is inferior to the white race, and if black people were ever to live in freedom next to whites, then gradual but certain extermination would be their fate. Therefore, Fitzhugh believed that by enslaving black people, whites were helping them. He said that slavery Christianizes, protects, supports, and civilizes him. He told his readers that the Negro slaves of the South are the happiest and in some sense the freest people in the world. Clearly, Americans had no deficit of justifications for why they had the right to own black people as slaves. However, all of these justifications were meant to do one thing: hide the fact that the real reason why white people enslaved black people is because of greed, profit, and power. Slavery was an economic system that produced extreme wealth, and white supremacy was the ideological justification that upheld it. The reason why white people came up with so many justifications for slavery is because in their heart they knew that it was wrong. They knew that they had no right to exploit and brutalize black people, so they constantly had to reassure themselves and ease their conscience. They had to constantly defend and justify a system that was clearly evil. They had to find some way to sleep at night.
To my white brothers and sisters, I'm not politically correct. I tell it like it is. When I hear someone say go back to your country, it's always from a white person directed at a black or brown person. But that makes no sense because our ancestors weren't from here, and we stole this land, and we're still colonizing it. And when I hear black and indigenous and people of color talk about reparations, I hear a white person in the background yelling reverse racism. But that makes no sense because white people have never been and are not being oppressed based on their race.
This one was really intense, and there is a feeling that some people are now starting to express. I fear that things are not just changing, but possibly moving backward, and not literally to the past, but in a way that feels familiar. So the question is, why do some people feel like progress is being challenged? Because right now I see Americans, they are demanding that they want black people to get back to slavery. They want slavery back to America, and it's crazy to see that the world, we are trying to move forward, but America still wants slavery to get back to America. Let's be clear about this whole thing. Slavery is, as it existed in the past, is over. It's illegal, and it's widely recognized as one of the darkest chapter in history tied tied to event like the transatlantic slavery and everything, So when people talk about going back, they are not just talking about anything. They're speaking literally. They are expressing a feeling, a concern that some system are now decision today remind them of an unfairness from the past, And that's where the convo begins, Because in recent years, we have been seeing the world changing and people are trying to grow, develop, and becoming more useful to each other. But when you see a country requesting for slavery again, it's crazy, And when that feeling grows, the language used can become even more strong than before, because it's emotional, it's tied to history, and it's a memory to many Black Americans, Now, on the other hand, many people don't just see it in that manner, They believe an opportunities exist, and they don't agree with the idea that things are now going backward. So you have to be very, very careful with this whole perspective. One side feels concerned, another side feels that like they are being misunderstood in America, and that whole thing brings tension in America. There is also something that's important people need to believe and understand, because history shapes perceptions. History shapes perception, and when community has experienced this whole thing, something has deep of slavery and segregation. Any sign of inequality can feel more serious, more urgent, and because of this whole thing, it connects to something bigger, something that already happened in those days, And at the same time, it's important to stay aware, because strong languages can express real emotion, but it can create understanding if it's taken for granted, literally, So the focus should be on what people really actually feeling. Concern about fairness, concern about opportunities, and concern about where they're heading to, And those concerns deserves to be discussed clearly, and people should know that people take things easy, but they may hurt somebody else, Not every fear is about what is happening now. Sometimes it's about what people believe could happen based on history, And that's where understanding becomes, okay? Because without it, the convo turns into a conflict instead of clarity. And people now start to blame each other, start to blame some other groups in America. And that's how the world is changing. So Americans are really thinking of how to call for slavery again in America. And it's going to affect people based in different countries, mostly Africa. They feel like Africa has the strongest men, strongest women, young men, the Gen Zs and everything. So they want to come and take over again, and that to bring back the history that passed a long way ago. And let's see how the thing will turn to, because we're all waiting to see how this whole thing will turn into. Okay, God bless you. Peace be with you. I'm out till next episode. I love you.